Robert and I are sharing this presentation. I'll do the first 5 minutes and then I'll pass you over to Robert. Okie doke. And I'm going to try and time myself. Okay, so everyone can hear me fine? Okay. So this is a story, a presentation about a technique that we're piloting called microtesting. And I'm going to start this presentation with an example. And this was an article that was published in El País, which is the leading Spanish newspaper. And this was published yesterday. And the renowned economist Roberto Serrano has overwhelming evidence that his students cheated. Well, no way, really. It's the time has come from an in-depth debate. So the technology does not signal the end of higher education. And there's two things I really want to draw your attention to. One is that if you read the top paragraph, the highlighted sections, says that he decided this year, 2026, would be the moment to introduce take-home assessments for his module. So there's a lot of questions that you might have there, but we're going to focus on what happened next for him. And he says it's very nice because you can really test students when you take them home. There's a real reason you wanted to use take-home assessments. But then, lo and behold, all his students cheated on generative AI, and his response to that was to cancel all the take homes and revert to in-person exams, which is something we're seeing quite a lot. So, this, I think, is fairly representative of a lot of what we're seeing across the sector. So the question is that Rob and I set out to do was, well, how do we design an intervention, a method that restores confidence in remote assessments, in a world where confidence is kind of shot because of AI? So there are really good reasons why we might want to keep remote assessments, things like essays, projects, and these sorts of things. I'm not going to go too far into these, but we identify 5 different rationales for why you might want a remote assessment. And the sad reality is that in the presence of generative AI, all of these become compromised, which is deeply, deeply suboptimal. And this is where micro-testing comes in. Well, oh, sorry, what do you do in response to this compromising? Well, there's a bunch of things you can do. You could follow Roberto Serrano's example and abolish all your remote assessments. Early, we used to talk about like trying to, get the students to think critically because the AI is not very good at that. But basically that's so trying to outsmart the AI is kind of was the strategy, but it's now basically a non-starter. Like there's two questions to whether AI can do something. One is yes, and the other one is not yet. So um and then you've got this around like, can we change our assessment practices to work with the AI? And I think Roberto Serrano is a really interesting case here because the reality is Roberto Serrano is not going to ask his students to deeply observe discussion groups amongst his students. And, this is a problem. And this is where microtesting comes in. Okay, so what is microtesting? It's a short confirmatory in-class test that students sit after submitting some work. It's not just, and it's assessing the same content as the remote assessment. So it's not just in-class testing and it's not a substitute for remote assessment because it's actually a test based upon the remote assessment. And in reality, they should just be quick. They can take place in a normal lecture. In effect, it's an assessment of whether a student engaged with their essay, not a test of the content itself. And in principle, what does it do? Well, it detects whether students understand the work they've submitted. In reality, it's AI agnostic. It's not actually telling students they can't use AI. So, which in effect, if you went straight to in-person exams, that's abolishing AI, from this sort of, eliminating AI. But it's valuable that students do learn to use AI very well. So all micro testing is a test of whether they understand what they submitted, whether or not they used AI or not, which is surely something that we should be striving for. And if students know they're going to have this micro test, then actually it incentivizes real engagement with the initial essay itself. And finally, yeah, and so hopefully it restores some legitimacy and confidence. So, in other words, it's quite a simple thing to use and to implement, but it's not simplistic in the way that because as I say, it has this really nice incentive effects. And the last thing that's really beautiful about it is that it addresses the adoption issue, in that educational innovations, if they're limited to one classroom, if they're not adopted by people like Roberto Serrano, who we saw at the start, then all you're affecting is 30 students in your classroom, not affecting the kind of the great structural change that we kind of really need. So I will pass you over to Robert, who's got some amazing results now.
Okay, thank you, Tim. So basically, in our project, we tried to answer three questions. First of all, we want to see when you compare the marks of the take-home assignment and the micro testing, are they correlated or not? Then we want to look at if you introduce micro testing, how does it affect the overall mark distribution? And the really cool thing, unfortunately, we're not going to present it today because we don't have the data yet. We want to see if you repeat the micro testing over and over again, does it change students' engagement or the way they learn, how they act in class, and so on? So this is next year. Hopefully, we're going to have this, and then you have something new about this. We introduced this in two econometrics modules. One is an introductory econometrics module in the second year, and then in the final year, a microeconometrics module. And both of them basically followed the same structure. They had the take-home assignment, they submitted it, and the next available lecture, they set in their in-class test. It's important to note that the questions are not new questions. So what we've just done, for example, in Econometrics 1, we took a regression output table, what they produced, put it into the test, and then students had to interpret the coefficients again. We also had some simple coding questions where we had a simple R code, nothing complicated. They just have to quickly say what is wrong or what is missing, so fill in the gap. So it's very, very, very simple. And so just verify that students remembered something from what they produced. Next slide, please, Tim. Now, here are the findings. So in the report, this is the take-home assignment. The mean mark was 70.5. So this is the UK system. It is very good. It's like everyone gets a first, basically. And yeah, but if you look at the test mark, that's not good. It's 42.7, which is just above a pass mark, which is 40. So you can see there's this big gap between the marks, between these two elements. And if you look also at the standard deviation increased massively. So I think, maybe go to the next one to see what happens in microeconometrics in our final year module. It's not that extreme, but there's still a big gap. Now we can see the mean mark is around the low 60s, but the test is still in the 40s. So again, we observe the same thing. There is a lower test mark, and also the standard deviation seems to be much bigger for the test than in the... that was too quick, Tim. Go back quickly. I have 30 seconds. So just I want to highlight as well, in both assessments, we found there's a positive correlation between the marks. But now you can go to the next one, Tim. We can see there's a lot of noise. And I think one thing that really worries us, and if you look at two graphs, so we have the marks of the take-home report on the x-axis and the in-class test mark on the y-axis. And if the students perform equally well in both, we would be on the 45-degree line. If we are above, that means students did better in the in-class test. And if we're below, that means students did better in the take-home assignment. And if we look, for example, the left-hand side, there are some students that's really, really troublesome. They got 75, 80, an excellent mark in the take-home assignment. But if you look at the in-class test, get a mark of 0, only 10. So I think this is really the worrisome pieces where I think the AI seems to foster for those two superficial learning. They cannot replicate things anymore a week later. Next slide, Tim. Now, what we also want to look at, what is the impact on the mark distribution when we introduce micro-testing? So just to help you with the notation, we looked at different weights for the in-class test. You can see in the beginning, 100% would be just the weight of the take-home assignment, and 0 is the in-class test. And then if you change the colors, go further down, we can see that we're increasing the weight of the micro-testing. And in both modules, we actually observe something which is interesting. First of all, there seems to be, if we reach a certain level of weight for the in-class test, that we just use a wider variety. The spread gets bigger. We seem to now using a much bigger scale of the marking criteria. And also in econometrics 1, we can also see the mean value seems to go into an area which we feel much more comfortable with, that students really have this level of understanding for the model learning outcomes than we would have had before we introduced them.
Robert,
Okay, now
I'm going to
conclusions.
ask you the conclusion, yeah.
Okay, that's the thing, conclusion. So what we find, we think that students use it, AI. Unfortunately, we think they learn often very superficially, and we think that our in-class test is a way not only to give students an incentive to try to not only rely on AI, but also think a bit deeper, undertake deeper learning. And finally, we also want to restate, the nice thing about this in-class test is that it's actually low cost. We all have done in-class tests before. We can still keep our take-home assignment, have the benefits from this one as well. So we do not have to reinvent the wheel, and we think it had quite a positive impact. I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Robert and Tim, for keeping to time. It's much appreciated. We do have a large number of questions that be good to go through. The first one is from Claude, who asks something which is close to my heart as well. I mean, how does your approach align with discussions on workload for students? Some universities are saying that we over-assess students already. So actually, this might, you're saying it's the same content, you're not adding new content, but you're actually having another point of contact. So how is this perceived? Is this extra work?
So, I mean, Robert, do you want me to answer
Okay, go ahead. And I can correct
so,
you then. Yeah.
so the micro test and the let's call it an essay or the project or whatever. Oops, sorry. They're both the same assessment in a way. It's just a different part of the assessment, and it takes place within a regular lecture slot. So in reality, to expect a student to attend lectures, I think is perfectly reasonable. It doesn't, in theory, if a student is fully committed to the essay in the way that you want them to commit, they needn't actually do any additional work for the in-class test because it's not new content that they're being assessed upon. So I don't think it actually dramatically does increase the load on the cognitive load or time load on students.
Okay.
So yeah, I don't think it's a huge issue.
Okay.
Also, we didn't have any students complaining about that there's an additional test. There are some that's unhappy if they get a lower, because of loss aversion, they at first the 70 mark, now it's 60s. I think these were the issues, but we didn't really get a complaint that it's too much work.
Okay. There's a question which is trying to provoke you, but what would be the consequence if you ditch the report and just move to the micro testing alone? I mean, why not?
Well, because then the whole point in keeping the report is that you actually, what you want, the reason we have reports, the reason we have take-home assessments is to encourage critical thinking, to encourage deeper levels to encourage more interesting tasks. The micro test is in the class, it assesses them in a couple of minor atoms of what they've done in at home. So, if you basically just got rid of the essay, then you're just in the realms of like a 10-minute in-class test, which is exactly what we don't want, really. That's the kind of response to AI that we're trying to avoid by doing something like this.
Okay. We've got another question which might make sense in terms of your research project. It would be interesting to see if students next year change their behavior. So if you could follow up the students, and see actually after this intervention that you guys have, they actually change their behavior on a permanent basis. Is that something you would consider? Is that something that's possible at all?
Actually, already started now with econometrics 2. We finished the exam boards, but we already have data, and we can also follow the cohort in the final year. So we're going to be able to observe them 3 times. So I think that's a good point, Carlos, what you raised. I think that's definitely something we're interested in. We're collecting data now.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you. Doug has got a question. It's not really a question, more of a statement. It says this approach makes a lot of sense. Students will have to learn the consequences of just copy pasting from ChatGPT. Obviously, that doesn't work. And B, the devil is really in the details of what these homework quizzes actually look like, obviously. I mean, it's how difficult you make them, how easy you make them. Do you agree?
So, I mean, yeah. So these are parameters that you can change around with. There's a mechanics and then there's a principle. I
Right.
noticed one of the comments talked about doing it in almost like vivas,
Mm.
and in effect this is the same principle as a viva or a discussion after submitting an essay. The difference is that when if you have cohorts of 500 or 600 students, where vivas would become impractical from a resourcing perspective, this is very, very scalable.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, I mean, we're very happy. If anyone's really interested, we're very happy to share the initial assessments and the little tests that we did set the students afterwards to really get a feel for what the two look like. But it's all the entire consideration is always around ensuring that it is fair. You know what I mean? It's making sure that
Yeah.
it's perfectly fair. Um,
Sounds good. There's a question from John. It's quite long, so let me see if I can summarize it. But he says, I often simplistically look at education as having three elements: teaching, learning, and assessment. I'm viewing this assessment targeting the micro quiz more as a meaningful assessment, and the take-home assignment as giving students an opportunity for learning, which is basically, what are your views? Do you agree with this? Is what you're trying to achieve?
Um, yes and no. So how you weight the two assessments is another parameter that, if we had nice wide pilot, the wider the pilot, the more we can play around with parameters. But there's Robert and I have talked about things that you might consider, things like scaling the essay mark on the basis of what they managed to actually produce in person. Or minimum pass marks on the in class to get any credit. So in fact, the real important bit is the essay, if you like. That's the important thing, but you only get the reward for the essay based upon how you
Right.
perform in class. But that's just another thing that we're kind of playing around with. We've played around with various different weightings, and as we move on, we'll keep messing around with it.
Okay, I think we still have time for a question or two. A quick question. Clodagh asks that, she's considering doing this at her own institution, and there's been some pushback from students. Did you experience any pushback? Students saying this is too much work, or it's not fair that you put me on the spot, or any kind of pushback from students?
No, I would say there was nothing about. Actually, often the engaged students actually were happy that they have an opportunity also to differentiate themselves from other students. So what we saw that actually some of the students who are very, very engaged, they didn't mind it. The students who did not engage that much, they also didn't complain. It's just afterwards when they saw that the marks reduced, we received some complaints, but it was manageable. So it was
Okay.
not that we were flooded with complaints about it.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
okay, Tim, go.
I was just going to say, so there's the other thing to bear in mind, which is something I've encountered myself and something I read about, which is this idea that actually hardworking students who are engaging meaningfully with essays and getting mid 60s and watching their peers who they know are basically just using AI getting first are actually getting quite angry that there isn't actually verification methods. And I think they, like Robert said, the good students really embraced it. And I did speak to a student at an open day or an event on Wednesday who was one of our second year students who did this method twice last year. And she thought it was an amazing idea. She really liked it because it was her giving her a chance to prove that she knows it in a way
Okay.
and that she hasn't just used AI.
Okay, one last question, which is a practical one. How do you deal with students with disabilities and students who have, rights to have extra time and all those things?
Robert?
What if, do you want to go, Tim? Oh,
Yeah. So because it's a very short test, it's 10 minutes.
Okay.
The idea of extra time is normally like a 25% or something like that. Um, we simply make so I saw Steffi
Okay.
suggested taking them in a different room. You could do that if you had a different room, but in reality, because it's literally the case of a couple of minutes extra they'd be getting, um, we any student who we knew had requirements would just be sat sort of at one side of the room, and they'd be the last that we collected, and we'd allow them two extra minutes or the
Okay.
extra 25% or something. But we handled it very informally. It's quite an informal setting anyway, because it's just takes place in a lecture.
Okay.
Um,
Well, I'd love to ask lots more questions about all this, but we have to move on for a third speaker.